My name is Raymond Antrobus. I'm a poet, I'm a teacher, I'm the author of The Perseverance, a book I wrote over about 5 years, and The Perseverance is the name of a pub in Broadway Market where my dad used to drink in, but ultimately I think the book explores what it was like going to a deaf school, the tension kind of between spoken, written and signed language, and different ways in which we navigate those different spaces, like a deaf space, a hearing space, and also I guess mixed race identities and growing up in different households. And it's an in-between book. It's a book in between lots of different worlds. So I'm here in Piccadilly Bookshop in the poetry section, the best section in the bookshop, and I'm going to just talk about 3 books which heavily inspired my work and the writing of The Perseverance. And the first book I'm going to talk about is Kai Miller, A Light Song of Light. I came across this book in 2010, so about almost 10 years ago now, and it completely kind of changed some ideas, some preconceived ideas about how a poem ought to sound. I was really moved by the voice that moves throughout this poem, and it felt true, and also it examines, lyrically, different, I guess, prophecies and histories within Jamaica, which is where half of my family are from, and I just kept going back to this book again and again and again. And I think that there's even a line in this book which I quote in The Perseverance. So this has had a huge impact on me, and I really recommend it. It's a great read. So the next book that I'm going to talk about is Chan by Hannah Lowe. Hannah Lowe is a Chinese, British, Jamaican poet, and she writes these narrative poems which kind of examine some of her father's history, being a Chinese Jamaican and coming to England, but also she finds out that Joe Harriet is a relative of hers, or within her close family friends, and she finds all of these little kind of stories about him, which she weaves into these very lyrical, sometimes anecdotal poems. What I really like about this poem, because I teach this book as well, is she has these forms called If You Believe, and she kind of poses that question of how important is belief and truth in poetry. And when you read some of these poems, you would never guess how much Hannah as a poet has given her gift to the story of her family, and had to kind of fill in the holes, the things she didn't know, but then had to kind of leap away, I suppose, from reality into an imagination. So I really recommend this book. It's been with me for a long time. So the third book I'm going to talk about is Voyage of a Sable Venus by Robin Coast Lewis, a poetry collection. If you know anyone who works in museums or has spent a lot of time in archives, or anyone who's a art conservator, you need to read this book. It is incredible because it looks at the language of archiving, it looks at the representation of particularly black women's bodies, and the way that the language that they are kind of in some ways categorized under. In some ways it kind of is in conversation with Surge by Jay Bernard, a book which came out fairly recently, which is also like a book very much rooted in archives and research. These poems are incredibly, again, they're narrative, but there's always something else to explore. I've read this book from first poem to last poem about 5 times, and every single time I learn something new. I see something that I didn't notice before. And you can also see, how interesting the white space. It's just visually, before you've even read any of the actual poems, it's just something very visually satisfying about the movement and space that this book plays with. And it's a difficult book. It's a book worth staying with, that will make you work for it. But the more you give, the more you give it, the more it will give back to you. So I highly recommend Voyage of a Sable Venus by Robin Coast Lewis.